Hello, welcome back. So today we will discuss Unit 3, Graphical Representations of Frequency Distributions. We have already discussed Unit 1, your basic ideas, Unit 2, your frequency distribution table, how you create your frequency distribution table, your cumulative frequency distribution table. Now, from your table, how will you present your data into a more graph visual or you will present your data more visually, okay, so that your respondents or your readers of your research or your thesis can easily interpret what is that about, okay, instead of flooding them with the numbers in your frequency distribution table. It is more appropriate to make the table into graphical representations of that frequency distribution table. Okay, so statistical data can be graphically presented according to their scale or level of measurement. So this graph shows your data essentially in uh, pictures. Okay, so examples of these are your pie chart or your circle graph, your histogram or your bar graph, or your line graph or your poly polygraph. Okay, so after completing this unit, you should be able to construct number one, pie chart. Number two, you should be able to draw histogram for your nominal, ordinal, and interval data. Of course, you should be able to construct your frequency polygon or your polygraph. Okay, and of course, your cumulative frequency polygon. Okay, so let us start with the first one. How will you construct a pie chart? Okay, okay, so pie chart often is used for your nominal data. Okay, remember, nominal data is your data that only has quality. Okay, it cannot be measured numerically, so it only has quality. Okay, so your circle graph or your pie chart is the best way to present your nominal data. Okay, so this chart or your pie chart can provide fast and easy presentation of that nominal data. Okay, so I'm sure you're very familiar with the what a pie chart looks like. So your pie chart is essentially a circle. So it is composed of how many degrees? It is composed of 360 degrees. Okay, so each categories in your nominal data represents a share or a slice of that pie. Okay, so if your one of your categories represents 50% of your data in your distribution table, that category should be able to or your pie chart should be able to show that that category uh, has 50%, or essentially your half of your pie chart should belong to that particular category. So what is the half of a circle? So we have mentioned your circle has 360 degrees, right? So half of it should be able to be should be equal to 0.5 times 360, right? So it's 180 degrees. So half or 180 degrees of that circle graph or your pie chart should belong to that particular category. Okay, let's say it's not 50%, let's say it's 35%. So you should just multiply that. Okay, you should just multiply that into 360. So that is 126 degrees. So 126 degrees, you should measure it in your protractor. 126 degrees should belong to that particular category. Okay? So let's have this figure number 1. Okay? So to better visualize how you will create your pie chart, let's have this. So you have your frequency distribution table, right? So here in table 3.2, this is your frequency distribution table for nominal data. So these are the number of graduates in a certain company. So you have your particular area and you have your number of graduates or your frequency. Okay, you have your category, your area, and you have your frequency, your number of graduates. Okay, for accounting, there are 75 graduates. Okay, for marketing, there are 62. For finance, there are 50. General management, there are 38. And other areas, they have 25 number of graduates for a total of 250 graduates in that company. So now, this frequency distribution table, how will you convert it into pie chart? Okay, remember that in a pie or in a circle, you have 360 degrees. Remember, you have these numbers, okay? So you have these numbers. Okay, you have these numbers, okay? 75, 62, 50, 38, and 25. So you have these numbers, okay? So what you should do is to determine how much or how many degrees each category represents, okay, in a pie. Okay, so how will you know that? You have to compute. You have to convert this frequency into percentages. Okay, you have to convert it into percentages. Okay, why? It's because a circle has 360 degrees. You don't know how much or how many degrees uh, accounting, how many degrees for marketing, how many degrees for finance. Okay, so you should first know the percentages of each category. How many percent of graduates belong to accounting? You only know it's 75 number of graduates. You only know total of 250, right? So how will you know how many percent accounting represents? So first, you should divide your 75 divided by 250, and then that will result to 30%, right? So 75 divided by 250, that will result to 0.3 times 100%, that should be 30%. So you know accounting has 30% or accounting represents 30%. Okay? And you should do the same for marketing. So if you do the same, 62 divided by 250, that would be equal to 0.248 times 100%. That will give you 24.8%. Again, do that for finance. That will give you 20%. Then do it again for general management. That will give you 15.2%. And then, of course, other areas that will give you 10%. So now you know each percentages, okay? You can now actually draw your pie chart. Why? Because you know that 30% of your circle should be occupied by accounting, okay? You know that 24.8 should belong to marketing, 20% should belong to finance, 15.2% should belong to general management, and 10% should belong to others. Okay? How will you how will you compute how many degrees? Again, just like what we did, 10% of 360 degrees. That is 36 degrees, right? So 36 degrees should be the area. 36 degrees should be the area of this category of others. Okay? So 36 should belong to others. Okay? And so on. You multiply it, 30% of 360. That's how many degrees should belong to accounting. Okay? Okay. So I'll show you the answer. Okay? So this is how you do it. So in this one, you know that accounting is 30%. So it should be the largest. It should be the largest on your circle graph or your pie chart, okay? And marketing is 24.8%, finance, and so on. The smallest should be other. How many degrees is other? That should be 36 degrees, okay? So that's how you draw your pie chart, okay? So it's uh, fairly easy, okay? You should compute first. If you have your frequency distribution table now for your nominal data, you have your frequency and you have your categories. You should first know how many percent over the total, how many percent does each category has. So if you have already determined how many percent each category will have, you will know now how many degrees. You convert that percentage into degrees. How will you convert this percentage? You just multiply you just multiply 30%, right? You just multiply it with 300, okay, 360 degrees, okay? Each of them, you multiply it with 360 degrees, and then you will know, you will know how many degrees should each category occupy. And then, of course, you measure that with your protractor. You create your circle, you should measure it with your protractor, and then you put labels for it. Okay, so accounting 30%, okay, marketing 24.8%, and so on. Okay, so that's essentially how you will create your pie chart. Okay, so another example, we have this your occupations of fathers of preschool age children. Again, this is again a nominal data. You have your category here, your father's occupation. You have your frequency. Okay, the total number of fathers there is 60. Okay, so you have 60 here. Now, what's your next move to create your pie chart? You should determine the percentages of each category. Okay, so after determining each percentages, actually you will have 35% for professional, proprietor 11.7%, craftsman 31.7%, others 11.7%, managers 10%. Okay? Again, those percentages, you should be able to convert them into degrees. How? You should multiply it with 360 degrees. We have 360 degrees in one circle, right? And then upon multiplication, you will get 126 degrees for professional. Here, this should be equal to 126 degrees. This one is 126 degrees, okay? Craftsman, that should be 114 degrees, okay? This is 114 degrees. And then so manager should be equal to 36 degrees. Proprietor and other should be equal to 42 degrees each, okay? So this is how you create your pie chart, okay? Okay, another example. You have here your percent distribution of savings and loan. Okay, so we have your categories: agricultural, commercial, industrial, consumption, and others. You have your percent distribution. Okay, okay, this one you actually have percent distribution already, so you don't need to compute for the percentages. What you should do is the next step already. From this percent distribution, you should convert it into degrees. Okay, how will you do that? You should multiply 360 for from each percent distribution. So 13.51 times 360, 26.17 times 360, 50.06 times 360, and so on. You will get your degrees. Okay, upon getting your degrees, of course, you are now ready to create your pie chart. Okay, and this should be the image of your pie chart. Industrial, 50%, right? 50.06%, okay? And so on, okay? This is how you create your pie chart, okay? So I hope that's clear. Again, so I said we have here activity. So we will know uh, if you have if you know how to construct already your pie chart, okay? What does a pie chart represent? It's essentially a graphical way to rep represent your frequency distribution table, okay? It represents the frequency for each categories, okay? So construct a pie chart using this data. Yeah, again, we have your data for uh, nominal data. We have your categories, your political party, and frequency, okay? So first thing to do, you should compute the percentages for each one. So you have your 25 divided by 90, so that should be equal to 27.7%. Should be able to multiply that to 360, okay? Multiply that to 360 degrees. So how many? How many degrees? That should be equal to 100 degrees, okay? That should be equal to 100 degrees, okay? So again, 100 degrees for your laban, okay? Again, compute for your LAMMP. So 18 divided by 90 times 360 degrees, right? You convert it into degrees. Your percentage converted to degrees. So that should be equal to 72 degrees. So your LAMMP should occupy 72 degrees in your pie chart. Okay? So do that again for your liberal. That should be 22, right? Your liberal should occupy 88 degrees. And then do that again for your Campi, 25. So again, that is 100 degrees. Okay? So the total of those four should be equal to 360 degrees. Now you already know your circle and each degrees for each categories. You are now ready to draw your pie chart. Okay? Just remember you need to label it. Okay? Each category and each percentage that they represent. Okay? Alright. So let's move on to histogram. Okay, what's this histogram? It's essentially a bar graph. Okay, very sure you're already familiar with bar graph. Okay, so how will you create a bar graph? So this is the steps. First, you should use your Cartesian coordinate, your x and y axis. Okay, your vertical line is your y-axis or coordinate. Your horizontal line is your x-axis or your abscissa. Now these two lines intersect, right? They intersect at a common point 0. Okay, 0 is your intersection. Okay, so from your intersection, as you go along your horizontal line, your x, so your value is increasing. Okay, 0, 1, 2, and so on. Okay, and then from your 0, as you go on upwards to your y-axis, your value increases again. Okay, 0, 1, 2, and so on. Okay, so that's your Cartesian coordinate plane. Now, what you should do is just you have your measurement in your y and you have your measurement in your x-axis. Okay, so how do you how do you plot it in a bar graph? Okay, so let's have this. Okay, so in constructing your bar graph, okay, so your vertical line actually, or your y, should represent your frequency. Okay, so remember that your frequency is in y-axis. Okay, and of course your x-axis should be your categories. Okay, for example, father's occupation, professional, 21, craftsman. Okay, this is the example previously. Okay, so instead of creating a pie chart, let's create a bar graph. Okay, for our nominal data. Again, your category should be in the horizontal. Your frequency should be in the vertical. So how will you do that? You just label it professional in your horizontal, and then your vertical line, again, vertical line from 0 going upwards, it increases, right? So professional, okay, look for the value of 21 in your ordinate or your y-axis. Then that's your professional. Create a bar from 0 until 21. Okay, so this is how it looks. Professional from 0. Okay, so if you look at it, this is your bar graph. So horizontal, your x-axis, you have your father's occupation. Okay, your y-axis is your frequency. Label it frequency and father's occupation. Okay, so you put each category here: professional, craftsman, manager, proprietor, and other. Now remember your frequency. So professional, you have 21, right? So from 0 until 21, you create a bar. Okay, so bar, do not create a line. A line is just 2 points. Okay, bar, bar look like this. Okay, this is called bar graph from 0 until 21. Okay, for craftsman, it is 19. So from 0, you have your from 0 until 19. Okay, again, manager from 0, how many? 6. Okay, so until 6. Proprietor is from 0 until 7. Okay, from others, 0 until 7. Okay, this is your bar graph for your father's occupation and the frequency. Okay, so this is how you create your bar graph. Okay, let's have another example. Again, this is nominal data, social aspiration. Okay, you have your frequency. Again, your x-axis should be your categories, social aspiration, and your y-axis should be your frequency. Okay, so creating that, again, frequency for your y, and then for your aspiration. Okay, so very high, high, moderate, low, and very low. This is your ordinal. Okay, this is an ordinal data. This is your categories on your ordinal, right? So very high, how many frequencies? Until, okay, until 9. Okay, so high 15, moderate 18, low 16, very low 12. Okay, so you remember that frequency, then you label it until 12, okay, until 18, and so on. Okay, so this is how you create your bar graph for your ordinal data. Okay, okay, now For interval data, rectangular bars should actually be joined or connected to emphasize the degree of differences. Okay? So let's have it. Okay? So these are the steps. Okay? So the data should actually first be organized into your frequency distribution. That's why we have discussed first your unit number 2. Okay? So before going into this unit number 3, you should actually be able to master how to create your unit 2 or your frequency distribution table. Okay? So after creating your frequency distribution table, what's the step? Okay? For interval data, this is the first step. Draw your horizontal line to represent your scores, and of course your vertical line to represent your frequency. Okay, this is scores is also your categories. Okay, select appropriate scale for the scores. Okay, and the frequency. You should actually write midpoints for the interval along the horizontal baseline and the frequency scale along the vertical line. Next, for each class interval, plot the corresponding frequency and draw horizontal line the full length of the interval. Okay. Lastly, to complete the graph, we may join the ends of these lines to the corresponding ends of the intervals on the horizontal axis. Okay. Okay, this is better shown. Okay. So let's have an example. So this is your frequency distribution table for your interval data. Okay, remember what when we created your interval data, right? Interval frequency distribution table for interval data, it looks like this. Okay, so you have your 65 to 69, 70 to 74, 75, and so on. This is your categories, okay? And this is your frequency. So you have already done your unit number 2, okay? So you have already created your distribution table, frequency distribution table from your raw data. Now the next one is to create a bar graph using this, okay? So how do you create a bar graph? First, you should draw your X and Y axis. Your X should be these IQ scores and this Y is your frequency, okay? Now what's the next step? You should be able to, what's the next step? You should be able to, instead of, if you look at this, the IQ scores, why is it that there's only one number here? This is actually your, remember your class mark, okay? This is actually your class marks, okay? Instead of the class boundary, you should put your class mark. What is class mark? It is the midpoint, okay? Okay, remember, 65 to 69. What is the class mark there? It is 67, okay? So we have put your 67 here. However, here, that is 65 and this is 69, okay? So you should put your class mark, okay? What's the next class mark? 72. Why is it 72? Because it is 70 to 74. Okay? So 65 to 69 was the frequency. It should be 1. Okay? 70 to 74 should be 0. If you look closely, 65 to 69, the class mark is 67, right? The frequency should be equal to 1. Okay? It's 1. Okay? 70 to 74, the class mark is 72. What's the frequency? It's 0. So there's nothing there. Okay? So again, you do that for each category. You find the midpoint or your class mark. The midpoint for the next category is 77. Again, the class mark or midpoint is 82, 87, 92, and so on. Now, the next step after creating your class mark is to plot your frequency. Okay, the frequency for 77 is 5. Okay, 82 is 6, and so on. Okay, now make sure you leave no space. Okay, there's no space between these. Okay, there's no space between these. Okay, there's no space between these class marks. Okay, between these x values or your abscissa. Okay, So that's how you create your interval bar graph, okay? Bar graph for your interval data, okay? Okay. So again, another activity, what is a histogram? It's essentially a bar graph, okay? What's the difference in construction? Okay, I'm sure you already know that the difference in construction for nominal, ordinal, and interval. Nominal and ordinal is actually almost the same. For interval data, you actually have to plot the class mark, okay? Instead of the categories or your class boundaries, what you will plot on your x-axis should be your class mark, okay? So in a histogram, what does x-axis? It's the same, okay? Your x-axis should be your categories, your y-axis should be your frequency, okay? So prepare histogram for the following. So, okay, so this is 4.1. I'm sure you already know that this is for your ordinal data. And then, of course, this is another for interval data. You should follow the steps. Okay, and then, of course, another one for your ordinal data again. Okay, this one, another for nominal data. Okay, another activity for your ordinal data again. Okay, so this is very easy for you to practice. Okay, should be able to practice with this. Okay, now let's move on to another kind of graphs called line graph or frequency polygon. Okay, this is the steps to create your frequency polygon. Okay, so again, in a histogram, we actually assume that all cases within it, no, on the class interval are uniformly distributed. Okay, however, in this frequency polygon, the difference with the histogram is here in polygon, we assume that all cases in each interval are concentrated at midpoint. Okay, so in the histogram, you actually assume that all the frequency are distributed uniformly in the class boundaries or class interval. However, here in polygon, we actually assume it that the frequency is concentrated on the midpoint. Okay, so that's just the only difference with it between them. Instead of drawing bars now, we draw lines or points. We first draw points, okay, and then we connect the points to make it a line. Okay, that's essentially your line graph. Okay, it's essentially how you will plot in your mathematics. Okay, you plot the coordinates. Okay, and then you connect the dots of the coordinates, and then you will have your function, right? So that's how it is in line graph. First, you should be able to do the steps of 1, 2, and 3 in constructing histogram, right? You just draw the x and y axis, you plot the class intervals and your frequencies, okay? The labels, okay? However, the difference is instead of drawing a horizontal line, okay? Instead of drawing a horizontal line representing your bar, okay, you actually put a dot. Okay, you put the dot there at the midpoint. Now, after fulfilling all of those for each class interval, now you actually connect those dots. And that's how you essentially create your line graph. Okay, let's have an example for you. The same example. Okay, this is the same example. Your frequency distribution table. Okay, as your compared to your histogram. So you should be able to do first steps, second steps, and third step of creating a histogram. However, the difference is instead of writing bar, okay, so instead of drawing a bar like this, okay, let me Okay, instead, let me represent it here at the highest one. Instead of drawing a bar like this, you should actually put a dot on the midpoint. Okay, you should put a dot here. Okay, put a dot here up top on the midpoint. Again, do those also for 97. Put a dot here. Okay, and then you just connect all those dots. Okay, and then you will create your, essentially, you will create a line. Okay, and then this is your line graph already. Okay, so that's just the difference between histogram and your line graph. It is essentially the same. The steps are essentially the same, but instead of drawing bars, you should draw dots, and then from those dots, you connect them, and then you will form a line. Okay, that's your line graph. Okay, so another activity for you to practice. Okay, this is again an interval data. Okay, you should memorize the steps. Okay, and other activities you should be able to practice. Okay, now let's go to the last one, kind of a graph, or your cumulative frequency graph, or your ogive. Okay, so cumulative frequency distributions, they are represented graphically by means of line graphs. Okay, known as cumulative frequency polygon. Okay, what's the steps here? It is essentially the same again with histogram, no? Except this time it is not the frequency that you should plot. What you should plot is cumulative frequency. Okay, remember in unit 2 we have discussed what is cumulative frequency, right? So instead of frequency that should be on the y axis, what you should plot is actually your cumulative frequency. Okay? Okay, that's your step 2, no? So instead of plotting points for your frequency, you should plot points for cumulative frequency. Okay? So let's have an example for you to understand. Okay, again, we have the same example here. Okay, instead of having plotting this frequency, you should actually uh, be able to create your cumulative frequency. Okay, so how do you create your cumulative frequency? This is less than cumulative frequency, right? So uh, less than cumulative frequency. So 1 plus 0, that's 1. 1 plus 5, that's 6. Plus 6, that's 12. Plus 8, that's 20. Plus 11, that's 31, and so on until it is 106. Okay? So what you will look into in cumulative frequency graph, it's not the frequency. You should look at the cumulative frequency. This is your x-axis and this is your y-axis. Okay, that's just the difference, no? Instead of plotting the frequency, you will plot the cumulative frequency. Okay? So again, do the steps from 1 to 3 in histogram, and then of course, instead of plotting your frequency, you plot your cumulative frequency. Okay? For 64.5, that's 1, right? Okay, this is 1. Okay? For 70 to 74, that's 1 again. Okay? So you should do it again, 1. Okay? And then this is 6, right? So this is 6, 12, 20, and so on. Okay? So instead of plotting this frequency, it should be 1, 0, right? 105. No. Look at it. It's 1, 1, 6, 12 until 106. So look at here. It is until 106, right? So 106. So you plot actually the cumulative frequency. Okay? So that's your number 2. Step number 2. Okay? Step number 3, instead of plotting a okay. So that's it for your cumulative frequency, no? So your step number three is just essentially what I said a while ago. Okay, so that's the difference. Okay, so instead of frequency that's you're plotting, it's cumulative frequency. Okay, all right. So another activity. So this time you have actually your raw data. Okay, you have raw data here, and then you should be able to set up frequency distribution. How many class intervals? Again, what I taught you, there should be 8. Okay, you should be, if you cannot remember how will you create a frequency distribution table, you should refer back to our previous lecture, okay, and then review it. Then you will be able to create this one, 4.1. And next, prepare a cumulative frequency distribution 4.2 table, and then of course 4.3, your cumulative frequency graph. Okay, so that's how you create your graphs. Okay, you should be first be able to create your frequency distributions. Make sure it is correct table, your frequency is correct, your cumulative frequency is correct, and then from that, if you fancy, you create your histogram. If not, you create your line graph, or if you are required, you create your cumulative frequency graph. Okay, so that's our unit 3, okay, for our lecture for today. Next meeting, we will take up now what you call your measures of central tendency. We will now calculate, okay, we will now calculate for your next meeting measures of central tendency.